Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This is the second part of my conversation with Jessica Helfand. If you haven't listened to the first interview with Jessica, I really encourage you to do so, as it's this really interesting conversation that covers all sorts of ground that we recorded back in July. But this conversation was recorded earlier this month when Jessica was a visiting critic here at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where I'm currently a graduate student. And we talk about a bunch of different things, like the history of Winterhouse, which is the studio she co-founded with her husband, Bill Drenttel, who passed away in 2013, and how the studio incorporated publishing and writing and design discourse into its practice. We also talk about the role of the designer in a post-Trump world and how design is never neutral. And we wrap up talking about Jessica's experience teaching design to business students at the Yale School of Management with Michael Beirut, and how these students are changing how she thinks about design. As is always the case with Jessica, this is a really wonderful conversation that gave me a lot to think about. And I always appreciate her generosity and her general support of my work and this podcast. And so, like I said in last week's episode, it means so much to me to talk with her, and I just always love hearing what she has to say. So let's get right into it. This is my second conversation with the great Jessica Helfand. It was really interesting because I listened to all of these interviews. I do a couple times in editing, and then when they're up, I listen to them to make sure everything's good. And I always realize how many things I miss, like from the guest, because I'm like so into the interview mode.
Right.
And so I was like excited because I didn't know that you were going to be here when we did our interview over Skype.
Right.
That I could listen to this and then ask you all the follow-up questions that I missed in the moment.
Perfect.
And like I just said, I was shocked and embarrassed that we didn't talk about Winterhouse at all, which I feel like is very important, and I actually have a lot of questions about. And the thing that I'm most interested in is kind of how the studio evolved over the years, and then I'm also interested in its relationship to Design Observer and to publishing and kind of all these other things that you were doing at the time. So I guess let's start with like how it started, and then a little bit of that trajectory.
Great. I haven't been asked this, I think, maybe ever. So let me try and
good.
dig into the bowels of my memory. So the simple answer was that we had very young children and couldn't figure out how to have very young children and have two different careers. And Bill used to like to say that I was envious of what he was doing at Drenttel Dole Partners, and he was envious of what I was doing with my clients then, which was then a new media world, right? So I worked with Ellen Lupton when she was at the Cooper Hewitt doing, a wall of type that moved. And I think about it now, comparatively, it's rather primitive to even imagine in the scope of what we know can actually be typographic movement in the world. So it's embarrassing to even say that. But so I was doing CD-ROMs for Voyager, and I did the very first website for the New York Times, and I was doing things that were experimental but still for clients. And Drenttel Dole Partners at that time was putting Martha Stewart in Kmart and doing Wamsutter sheet packaging, and went on to do incredibly great things. In any event, short answer, he left Drenttel Dole Partners, and I had been sharing space with Abbott Miller in New York. Abbott would later go to Pentagram, and we
I didn't know
decided to spend, we bought a tiny little house in the country, and we loved it up there. And because we had a dial-up modem, we could be there 4 days and here and in the city 3 days.
Right.
And then our second child came, and we decided to move at a time when we still, I think, had a dial-up modem. The big change happened when we found this crazy house, and the house had been built in 1932 for the guy who did the murals at Radio City Music Hall, and he had a studio that he painted in diagonally, and we put up a lot of bookshelves, and our book collection grew and grew and grew. And then the big thing I think that made Winterhouse was a studio in a house where there was this really immense, deep library. And because Bill had this kind of indefatigable, endless curiosity for many things besides design, we had a pretty good science library. We had a pretty good political library. We had a historical library. And my father and Bill were both collectors who had a pretty good antiquarian library. And then of course there was type and photography and art. But so we started to find that we could do research at in our own library and not have to go to a real library and do work that had kind of a deep intellectual well of opportunity.
I watched a video today in preparing for this. I think it was like an AIGA video or something, and it was in the studio.
Exactly.
And there was these it looked like 2 stories of books.
There were, I think, 17,000 books there.
That's incredible.
15,000. I mean, just ridiculous. It was ridiculous. And very well codified. I mean, we knew everything that was there.
That's amazing.
It was great. I mean, I loved raising children in my studio. We never had to sit over them to do their homework because they saw us there working all the time. They were introduced to world music because we had young people like you working for us. And so there was great music always playing. And so the culture of Winterhouse was a very special place.
Yeah, I mean, I could tell that from that video, which I think it was an AIGA video.
Yeah.
And when I talked to Rob Giampedro, he had nothing but good things to say about his time there, and said that it was I think the phrase that he used was his grad school was spending time there. And so I'm interested in how maybe that, I don't even know how to phrase this, but that library and the kind of intellectual side was feeding into the work that the studio was doing, or influencing the clients, or
yes. So I would say a couple of things. One is that Bill was a total control freak, and so the clients that we had tended to be people that he felt were worth his time, and there tended to be a sort of intellectual bent to that. So I loved hearing you talk about the Michael Rock's intelligence and highly analytical mind working in fashion. I don't think Bill had that. He was really, really smart, but I don't think he had the capacity to understand how to bring that game to a very commercial client. And so we tended to have, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Archives of American Art, the Poetry Foundation. We tended to have intellectual clients, or at least culturally resonant in an intellectual space that Bill could understand and make sense of over time. And Teach for America, we worked with Wendy Kopp for years at Teach for America. And, a lot of repeat clients, a lot of long-term things, but I think always a very serious, he wanted things to be serious, and I used to long for things to be a little less serious. Time to time, I have to, truth be told.
I can see that. I believe that.
But so that's one piece, and then Design Observer grew out of that because I was starting to write books.
Okay.
And I always started a book by floating an article in a magazine first. So I wrote a little thing for the New Republic, or I'd write a little thing for the AIJ Journal, and I would see if there was, some kind of, if it stuck.
Right.
There was some response. If I felt that there was a sort of an appetite for engaging that in a deeper way. And then, suddenly I would write a couple more essays and I had a book. So my first 2 books were like that. And then at some point, I think this was the early 2000s, 2003 to be exact, blogs were starting to be a thing. And Bill very quickly thought that this was an opportunity to engage in a very interactive way with a kind of design criticism that had not been possible in print publishing.
Yeah.
And so it was born.
So was that, when we talked the last time, we talked a lot about the Design Observer side. So I'm curious of how publishing Design Observer then reflected back into the work you're doing in the studio. Were they 2 separate? Did you view them at the time as 2 very separate things, or were they very kind of influencing each other?
I think they were very much influencing each other. There were other things along the way that I think would not have come up had Design Observer not been the kind of connective tissue between some of our endeavors. So, for example, we did a Winterhouse Writing Prize for a number of years, and it was just, it was an onerous task to read that many.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
There were piles and piles and piles of paper to read, but that very much dovetailed with publishing and I think more than publishing, really sponsoring and encouraging young writers. We were looking for the next generation of Steve Hellers and Ralph Kaplans and Michael Rocks and iMagazines and really to sort of cast that net. I mean, Design Observer very specifically in its moment looked to, in many ways, I think other people do that now. I'm thinking of Lucy and Roberts in England in graphic design, and they do a sort of beautiful series of publications about design as it intersects with other things. That's very much what we wanted to do, was to cast this net around design as it related to not just our preaching to the choir world. So the Winterhouse Writing Awards was one. The other one, which I think came out of the kind of public engagement that Design Observer afforded us, was the Polling Place Photo Project, which was, I think, as much a function of being aware. I mean, you have to remember, Winterhouse was this big, beautiful house in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So we started, I think we just felt this need to constantly push the envelope in terms of being aware of a world outside. Right. It was such a bubble.
Oh, okay.
So we I'm going to come back to this question of the Polling Place project in a minute, if you want to edit this piece out. But when we moved to the country, we immediately started working with the Times of London and Netscape in California. It was like we wanted to prove to ourselves that even though the airport was 2 hours further away, we were going to go to Europe every 6 weeks and work with the Times of London.
Okay. Interesting.
It would have been so much easier if we'd stayed in New York. I mean, it was just so far to have you'd get to Kennedy, you have to go another 2.5 hours. But we did it. We wanted to be international. We wanted to be interactive. We wanted to have young people. We wanted to have other voices. And so the Polling Place Photo Project very much was a function of that. Suddenly people had smartphones, they could take pictures. The ease with which civilian journalism and photography was starting to become evident to us made us realize that there was a way to take on the election. And we did it twice. We did the midterms in 2006, and we did the 2008 election when Obama was elected. So there were two moments.
That one, I think.
And we partnered with the New York Times, and they put a call to action on the front page of their website. And so, I mean, did this become an overarching view of our sense of our own political kind of activism? Not really. I think they were experiments, all of them. They were these sort of piecemeal experiments. We worked with Andrew Sloat, who made a wonderful video for us when Obama was elected. We did an exhibit of all the photographs in Hartford. So, somebody else might have really taken this, to the White House, but we didn't. But I think, to come back to your original question, Design Observer opened up channels of opportunity and engagement that would not have been there if we'd stayed in the little echo chamber of Winterhouse per se.
Yeah. So is that, I was looking on I think it was the Winterhouse Wikipedia page today, and it had a section on I think it was called Winterhouse Publishing, where you're essentially a publishing house. Did that
Winterhouse Editions?
Winterhouse Editions, was that after Design Observer had already, was that something?
That was always there. So when Bill had a thing called William Drenttel New York, when he was at Drenttel Dog Partners, where he published, may his soul rest in peace, the most boring, small little books. I mean, they were adorable and fantastic to look at, and letterpress, and they had, calf sewn, whatever that. But because I know I still have many of them, and I've just been trying to unload them. But he loved literature, and he loved publishing, and he loved books. So he always had a publishing imprint. And so when we formed Winterhouse, which was originally our names, and then we took over the House of Ezra Winter and turned it into Winter, because everyone knew it as the Winterhouse, and the guy's name who built it was Ezra Winter. We decided that we wanted to continue that imprint, but make it about things that we wanted to do there. And so we had a very short-lived publication called Below the Fold that we did from there. We did, so they were always sort of our version of pentagram papers. We were always looking to. But then there was another very savvy strategic thing Bill did, which was every time I wrote a book, two things. One is that every time I wrote a book, it was, we had it in our contract that there was a book with Princeton Architectural Press. It was a book with Yale University Press. It was always a Winterhouse edition. So then it basically, there was no financial remuneration, but it amplified this connection for us to us as publishers. That was one thing. The other thing was that Bill was a very savvy businessman, and whenever we designed a book for someone, we did a lot of work for University of Chicago over the years, because we have a wonderful friend there who's an editor. We designed books for Susan Sontag, for Picador, and we did books for the Poetry Foundation. Whenever we did books with a publisher, we would get a credit as a Winterhouse edition often on those books. And then finally, Bill would buy the world English-speaking rights to a book, sell them to Chicago or Yale or Princeton, and then have Chicago or Yale or Princeton hire us to design the book. So we then got a design fee. Now, if you know what design fees are in books, you'll know that this was not exactly going to subsidize tuition for our kids in college. But be that as it may, it was really a brilliant move. So
it's really interesting, actually.
So he loved really sort of macabre, Dickensian, depressing things like he loved Kafka, and he loved German writers and Austrian writers, and so he would find these really dark, depressing books and buy the World English rights and sell them to Chicago, and then we would design them. And so it was this very kind of canny meta universe of being a publisher, being a client, being a designer.
Yeah, that's such a. I mean, I feel like I could.
Now you have my secret, and now you can go forth and conquer and start buying the World English rights.
I know. I feel like I could spend the rest of our time asking questions about this now. But I'm not going to do that because I don't know how interesting that would be for everyone else. I'm interested, actually, though, something that you said about kind of you were starting to write books at this time also, and this is a question that I've started to ask a couple of the people that I've interviewed is, how has writing kind of changed how they think about design or how they actually design? And then vice versa, like how did being a designer influence how you are as a writer?
Well, I'm going to answer the second half first, if I may.
Of course.
When designers write their own books and design them, copy editors go crazy because they do crazy things like I do, like no hyphenation. So I rewrite sentences so that the rags are nice. It makes my copy editors crazy. There's a wonderful sense of control when you're designing the book.
So before I now have a question. When you're writing a book, are you writing it like visually? Or are you writing
No, but I'll tell you what I do visually. I spend a lot of time on the table of contents, like as much time as I spend on the book. Because for me, the organizational conceit of a table of contents is like the organizational conceit of a collection.
Yeah.
So if it's 6 chapters or 12 chapters or 34 chapters, there's always a rhythm to the way I write my TOCs, because that gives me an understanding. It's an armature for me. It's basically the infrastructure of what I'm going to do. I like the sort of numbered list of the expectation. I love the taxonomy of it.
Okay.
And so once I'm able to wrap my mind around that, and I have, when I wrote my book on scrapbooks, I easily spent as much time trying to figure out the table of contents as I did writing the book. I mean, it was really, because it was such a morass of information. In my most recent book, equally so, I went to Paris and wrote most of it, but I had to have a really firm outline of what I wanted those things to be. And then when I turn the book in, I often will decide I want to add a chapter, because when I look at the sort of whole thing, I need to have an epilogue, or I want to rewrite the opening, or I want to shift chapters around, because then you have the sense that the choreographic whole has to be in some kind of envelope.
So you see, I mean, I cut you off from the
not at all
train of thought that you were going, but so do you see like your like design mind, I guess, most manifests itself in your writing through that kind of editing process?
For me, yes. For me, it's a structural, infrastructural set of conditions. Just like when you teach, you think about what the limitations are of the assignment. I have to think about what the limitations are. Scrapbooks, I was 1863 to 1945. I had to, if I went past that, or I went to books in England, I never would have finished the book. So some of it is temporal. Some of it is conditional. Some of it is architectural, about the confines of the language you're using. It almost doesn't matter, but you have to, I think, for me, think of, it's very much like writing assignments. So it's very much about the language, but I write visually. Okay. So that's the second half of the question. So I had a very brief career as a television writer.
Yeah, we talked about this last time.
And I wrote really visually. I wrote descriptively, and I tend to write descriptively. It's probably the best and the worst of my writing is that it is very descriptive.
Interesting.
I get really excited about writing when I have a subject that excites me. I have an idea for my next book at the moment that I'm obsessed with, and it's creeping into all kinds of things it shouldn't creep into, because I'm looking to make sense of it all the time. Late at night on my laptop, notes that I write, things that I mean, it's terrible. But eventually, hopefully, it'll be a book. So for me, sometimes, and I think this is probably also a very visual conceit, I build a collection of something. And I'm sort of serially monogamous with collections. and I build a collection, and there's a curatorial understanding of that kind of albatross in my head and usually in my studio. And I need to make sense of it. And the making sense of it is the writing part. It can't just be, I'm now going to write a chronology of every linen postcard ever made in 1935. I can't, and there are people that do that and they do it beautifully. But for me, there has to be some social intent. There has to be social history. There has to be some larger scope of understanding about something that takes me into history of science, or takes me into the history of culture, or takes me into something that's about like the chasm
Right.
between sort of that it's the connective tissue thing again.
Yeah. How the last time that we talked, you mentioned something. You mentioned it before we even started recording about how you see that you're kind of like swiveling between your
I'm always swiveling
writing self and your making self, I think is how you phrased it. And I think when we talked last time, you included teaching in there also.
Very much so.
And I'm really interested in like we kind of talked about it in a very theoretical and kind of wide way. I'm very curious from like a very practical way, how does that look? Like, what is that swiveling like on like a day-to-day basis, or like
it's a wonderful question you ask, and I'm not sure there is one answer, because I think if I had given that answer 6 months ago and I were to give it today, they might be two completely different things. My current thing that I'm now teaching in the business school.
Yeah, I want to talk about that also.
And this really has to inform I mean, these people are brilliant at what they do, which is not what we do.
Yeah.
It is so different. The people that I find myself aligning with more and more are the organizational behavior people, who are psychologists and sociologists, and they study all sorts of things I don't know anything about. But by and large, they're very outcome focused. They use words like takeaways and benchmarks and stakeholders, and we don't use language like that. Yeah. So I am finding more and more I am in the business of asking questions, and I don't have any answer. I have so few answers. Or what I want is for you to have the answer. I write books so that I will seed the questions and the ideas of others, and maybe they will help come up with their own answer. What does that make me? I don't know what that makes me. A troublemaker, probably. But I don't like public speaking. I don't like getting up on a soapbox and talking about my version of the world. I don't like buzzwords. Everything points to me being a theorist. Right. Everything points to me being maybe a futurist. That sounds a little bit highfalutin. I think theorist at least is, I'm more comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And I find that like this last book has thrust me into a territory I never thought I would be in, which is that I am now getting calls and having conversations with people about ethics all the time. Design ethics.
Yeah.
How design is complicit in a kind of purveying of false authority. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. If what we do is essentially the physical evocation of what sociologists call confirmation bias, right? Yeah. So if confirmation bias is, if a person is good looking, you're more likely to believe them. Mm-hmm. Well, if design is beautiful or provocative or desirable, are we not complicit in actually making something ethically, morally questionable? Right? So yes, we can say we're not going to work for clients who invest in, global warming. We can say that we are going to be aware of our clients' political agendas. We can print with soy-based inks. We can do a lot of things. But this last book was about consequence and about trading hubris for humility. And I find that suddenly, particularly if you don't mind me saying so, since the election, I am being asked to have questions about things. How far I have strayed from my little studio, which I still call my temple. As long as I'm in the studio, because if I'm in the studio and there are pencils and there's paper there, I'm not just pontificating on some stage. I don't want to pontificate on a stage. This is my favorite kind of thing to do, which is why I'm podcasting. Because you can really do these one-on-one, you can have these conversations, you can put these things out there, you can then have later, someone will hear you and say, I was driving in the car and I heard you talking to Jared Fuller about, I want to know more about that.
Right.
So interestingly, here we are, two visual people having a conversation about the things that keep us up at night.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as you were saying that, I was also thinking about the election and the world that we find ourselves in now, and design's role in that. And you and Michael wrote a piece about design being this kind of optimistic profession.
His word.
but it's interesting to me how much design in like a wide sense is being talked about around these things, with things like fake news. I think is a very design problem.
It is a design problem.
And like filter bubbles and
echo chambers.
These are all design issues. And so hearing you talk about that, you're getting calls to talk about ethics is like, to me, that's the stuff that I hope I can kind of get out of these types of conversations in this podcast, is that design criticism is not just, and I feel like I said this in every interview, is not just, fonts and colors and
not
whether
anymore.
the kerning looks good, but needs to talk about all these other things.
Right. And we should because other people can read Ellen's book on Become a Typographer, the book I recommend to everybody in the world. Other people can learn to be designers, and probably if they put in all the hours we've put in, learn to be makers. But I think this next phase of the world's existence is going to face far fiercer problems, and it sort of it obliges us to ask much more penetrating questions. So one way to look at it is, and this is the point of view I take in my book, is that it's our humanism that makes us, separates us from the rest of the world. But what does that mean? That means, I said to somebody recently, good designers look, great designers listen. It means listening. Right. It means, if you look at post-war design, which really was such a response to the tumult and the unrest of the war, looked to neutralize the things that we felt were really concerning us. And that's not an appropriate response anymore. That's not, when we talk about inclusiveness, we don't mean that. We mean the opposite of that. So suddenly we're dealing with a topography of design being quite different. Another way to look at how design is changing, and our approach to making it a more holistic, inclusive platform for the dissemination of ideas, is to think about design as communication first, form second. And I haven't said that out loud yet, but it's something I've really been thinking about a lot, which is that our responses are no longer formal. They're platform based. They're system based. We all, certainly in social media and Twitter. I mean, Donald Trump's tweets look like my tweets. Same typeface, same length, same box. So you think about all of how design education has really privileged formal, evocative manifestations of physical form. Those forms have changed. Graphic design is no longer graphic in the sense of two-dimensional. But now look where we are. If the thing that is actually leading fake news, if the thing that's disseminating information, if the fact that we are all of us visually literate, anybody that has a screen and uses it is thought to be visually literate, what are we design people doing to make for a better planet? We have to get out in front of this. And so the way to get out in front of this is to maybe change our educational system, change the conversations we're having, change the way we have the conversation, change the tools we have to have the conversation, understand ethics and humanism and the boundaries of moral capacity, understand what international trade means, which means understanding nations that are not our own nations, which means design has to be a more international language than it's ever been. So what does that mean? That comes back to form, because it has to be visual. So it's a big loop. So I've just completely told you something that completely seems to counter-indicate what I first started saying, which is it can't be just about form. And yet I'm working with these. I'm working on this project with Yale and product. It's interesting. I've been talking to Michael Rock about it a little bit, and Susan Sellers, but I'm working with the possibility of looking at social enterprise in Italy as a little test case that would then be social enterprise in France and social enterprise in India, social enterprise in Africa and Mexico and Asia, because Yale has 28 partner schools they work with. And I'm trying to figure out a way to create a little design incubator that we can then throw out to all of these schools. So design can start to be taught not as an imperialist, colonialist
that was
enterprise,
my next question.
right? Because so much, if you go back to that language, and I'm sorry I'm rambling, but I'm like, I think this is a thing. If you go back to that post-war, postmodern language of neutrality, that's torpedoing in with a clean solution. That's not what's going to work. What we need to figure out how to do is create these teams, these operative, organisms that can kind of self-select on the ground, but maybe through technology and design and our basic fundamental understanding as communicators, start to seed a new revolution that says that there's a way to talk about this stuff. So this all comes back to the designer as an ambassador of communication, who then makes form. but can't be based on form only.
I love that. I mean, that the idea of like kind of the modernist neutrality is something that I'm very obsessed with lately, and I've been thinking a lot about, and how that just doesn't work.
It can't work anymore.
And this, kind of crystal goblet design is neutral. Like, we can't keep believing that that's what we do. That's the work we do is that way.
Right. It's not. It's scalable in a way that's not going to end well.
Yeah. Yeah. So is this? I mean, this leads in. We just have a little bit of time left, but does this where the work you're doing with the business school connect? Because I think it's interesting that you're teaching design to business students, and this idea that design now is kind of everywhere and influencing everything. Is that kind of where
absolutely?
What you're doing
so we began by we spent a lot of time in our first 6 months disabusing them of the notion that design thinking is the way to go. With no slight on IDEO and on the Stanford D School, but it's been 10 years and it's California and it's time for something new.
Yeah.
And it would be a real missed opportunity for Yale University to take a regurgitated version of something that existed 10 years ago in Silicon Valley and make it their own. So Michael Beirut and I were very much on the same page. And this is very consistent with our goals for Design Observer, which is there's two things we want to do which are very in line with the dean's mission. One is to be very global. It's because you all, your generation, all of us, but especially your generation, will inherit a much more globally connected world. And Yale's already got this partner network of schools, which is phenomenal. And the second is to really connect it to the humanities at the university. So we've got 42 libraries. If I want to have a speaker come in and talk about, I don't know, the High Line, why wouldn't I bring someone from the School of Architecture and the School of Public Health to talk about, the School of Forestry? We have all of these other opportunities to create a much more, I think, exciting and high-level conversation. And suddenly then design, I hear people say design should have a seat at the table. Well, maybe we build the table and first we bring our own chairs and they come. And so we are, we've been hired, not to get ahead of myself, we've been hired for 3 years with 3-year appointments. We're teaching a bunch of classes. The whole thing could completely fall apart, but we thought we've got 3 years to try to make something happen, and so we are trying to make something happen.
So how has this, so you finished one semester?
Yeah.
How has that semester changed you as a designer, or changed how you think about design?
I have to talk myself off the ledge a lot because I am one person. There's 600 students, and Michael and I are the only people there. I said we feel sometimes like, remember the school nurse in grade school? And there was like one of her and 600 of you?
Yeah.
They are people who speak a different language in many ways than we do. And I don't want design to be relegated to this sort of peripheral location. At the same time, what we do, design is so process-oriented, and they're not makers. So one of the things Michael and I are going by is this kind of model that we're teaching design as a second language. So sort of the tapas idea of design. Yeah. So we're not looking for literacy, we're looking for aptitude. We're looking for a little respect and understanding. I mean, short term, we build skills. Long term, we have better clients. When I first came, somebody said to me, "We want you to teach our students to lead better creative teams." And I said, creative teams don't want to be led by your students. They want to work with your students. Yeah. Right? So I feel that I will be perfectly frank. I'm a woman. There's not a lot of women there. It's not a tenure track position. There's a lot of tenured people there. In the art school, where Michael and I have taught for 20 years, no one has tenure, so it's a much more of an even game. But it's also not managed in this way. These people really, they run it like a business, and I've learned so much. Yeah. I mean, they're just. I'm going to give you one quick example. The laws of supply and demand there are different. So I'm teaching an elective in the spring on the design-driven business in Italy for 7 weeks, which will eventually be the design-driven business next year in France and then India. And I'm looking to see if I can incubate this little way of looking at design as a prismatic lens for somebody specific to that culture and that country, bringing people from that country on satellite, all that sort of thing. So I thought I'd have 10 to 15 students, and I got money. I got them to make allocations to bring 10 to 15 students with me to Milan to go to the Prada Foundation to a conference in May. 40 students signed up. Wow. So I assumed they'd be mad at me, and they were thrilled because it shows demand. Yeah. And they said, "We'll figure out a way. We'll find a way to pay for it, or the students they'll go on a cheaper flight." And that's the kind of creative problem solving that I haven't actually seen in my 20 years at Yale a lot of, that I was really impressed by. Like if you say, if I say jump, they say how far. I mean, if they say think big. Yeah. They say keep going. They say great, you should, build it. I mean, and we'll figure out how to pay for it. And maybe we can't do it for another 3 years. But what I love about them and what has given me renewed vigor, which you can probably hear in my voice, is they'll admit what they don't know. They'll help you find a way to get it. Yeah. They know, they have creative minds like I have never seen. They're not my creative mind or yours, but they know how to walk around a problem in a way that's really interesting. And I feel like my mind is being opened to a whole new way of working. Now, I have to go back to my studio at night because I feel like I have been, walking in trenches without the proper footwear. I mean, it's really been a learning curve. But I've learned more in the last 2 weeks than I learned in the 2 weeks prior. And I feel like, 3 years from now, if we have this conversation, I might actually know what I'm doing. In the meantime, they really are hungry for designers to talk to them. And Michael and I have had this very interesting 12 weeks of bringing in movie producers and doctors and Danny Meyer from Shake Shack, Paula Scher. We've brought in all these different people. And so we're trying to scope out for them and with them a way for this community to build its own design language. Yeah. It's not design thinking. It's going to be its own thing. And my God, if we get there, it won't be just me and Michael. It will be us, as leaders, building them into their own leaders. I mean, it's a management school. It's not a business school. These kids are going to lead. They're future leaders. Yeah. And so I'm spending a lot of time thinking about what is design leadership. What does that even mean? Is that a thing? Is design leadership a thing? Well, to come back to this question of humanity, I've been asked to speak to the National Organization of Philanthropists in the spring. Okay. And I said to somebody recently, I don't know anything about philanthropy. And he said, look it up. There's a synonym for philanthropy is humanism. You just wrote a book on humanism. You're probably a good choice. And I said, oh, okay, I can do that. That I can do.
Interesting. I have two questions to wrap it up. One is a semi-big question, and then
I'll try to be brief.
And then one that I think is a little bit smaller. And I wasn't planning on asking this first one, but based on what you said, is so much of what I'm doing with this podcast and my thesis and all of this is kind of design criticism and interested in how we talk about design and how we talk about design to other designers, like how designers should be talking about design between each other, but then also how design should be talked about outside of us.
Wonderful.
And I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on that. I don't really have a specific question.
Yeah, it's good. I have one thought on that for you, which is because you're a very articulate person, and many designers are, and the ones who aren't should become more articulate, is that we have to be not afraid to ask the tough questions. And sometimes tough questions are hard with words, and that's when we move to images, and then we can come back to words. But I think the more we choose to work internationally, so I think design criticism, to come back to your question, with people who aren't just us, is opening up the conversation about visual culture at a moment when visual literacy is really on the threshold of something quite new and extreme and exciting. Right. But we have to, so we are the ambassadors for making sense of all of those things. Yeah. And that's why design criticism, your work that you're doing with this podcast and with this thesis, I think is at a very opportune moment and could catapult you to the next phase. I mean, podcasts didn't exist a bunch of years ago. Yeah. And now the great thing about podcasts is realizing who hears them, who listens. I'm always hearing people that I went to grade school with who will be listening to this in some other part of the country that I've never even been to. You realize you have a reach with words that then we can build into an infrastructure with other kinds of things. And that's where our own visual literacy, which is, of course, I think, worthy of respect, is going to matter.
Yeah, I love that. My last question, I wanted to, since you're here in Baltimore and like that this is in real life, I was curious about how you think about being like a visiting critic at MICA, or like what, not even at MICA specifically, but what is this like for you to like come to a school where you don't know any of the work?
And you should probably ask me tomorrow after I've seen the work. Yeah. Well, I'll go anywhere if Ellen tells me to go, because I'm a huge Ellen Lupton fan. I always have been.
Isn't everybody? Aren't we all?
And her under her guidance, the work here is always interesting to me. I hunger to look at work, and particularly with graduate students, because I'm not teaching graduate students right now. I teach freshmen at Yale, I teach this course on the color blue with freshmen, and they're super, super, super smart and wonderful, but they're young and unseasoned, and so their intellectual reach in terms of their capacity to engage ideas as form givers and idea seekers is perhaps not what yours is. So I'm always really happy to, and also the shorter answer to all of this is that I went to Yale as an undergrad, as a grad student. I've taught there for 20 years. I'm such a lifer there. I will just, anytime anybody invites me, unless it's like, Wyoming in February, I might actually resist. But yeah, I'm always really happy to go to other schools and schools where they are under the guidance of people who are really at the top of their game and always have been, like Ellen. So it's a great privilege.
I love that.
I'm excited.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh my God, I'm
so
excited, selfishly so excited to see where you go and this work goes.
This episode was recorded on December 4th, 2016 in Baltimore, Maryland. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.